Okay. Good morning, everybody. Let's get started. Welcome to the OMUG event on emerging or modeling emerging technology. My name is Leming Wang. I'm an associate professor at Penn State, and along with Sarah Weidner and Kyle, we are coordinating the OMUG event for this is last year of our 2-year and another 2-year appointment. So this is one of, for those of you that I think most of you have been OMUG event before, but if this is the first time, we have been organizing event focused on the modeling thing throughout the year. We'll have some announcements for our next event. Those on the page we'll probably talk about later towards the end of this panel or seminar. So for today, of course, we have 4 excellent panelists. Each will represent a different angle of modeling emerging technology that's happening, research and modeling work happening throughout the state. So I will do a little bit introduction for each of the panelists after we go around the room to do self-introduction. We have actually, I believe, more folks on the phone than we have in person. More or less even at this point. Cool. So why don't we go around and do a little bit self-introduction. So basically just state your name, where you're from, or which organization you're working for. I think just a very brief one. So I've already done that, so we'll just go this way maybe. Sure. Why don't we still do that, Joe?
All right. I'm Joe Broach. I'm a senior researcher and modeler at Portland Metro, also at Portland State University, where I did my PhD. I've worked primarily in the non-motorized, but more recently I've been working just in general in emerging technologies, data sources, and modes that I'm going to talk about today.
Ray Jackson with the Mid-Willamette Valley Council of Governments in Salem. We staff the MPO for Salem-Keizer.
Nick Meltzer, staff the Corvallis Area Metropolitan Planning Organization and also work for Cascades West Council of Governments.
I'm Susan Aspert. I'm with Moonshadow Mobile. Mobility analytics platform. We use a lot of the new types of data in that platform.
Great. Sarah Weidner with Oregon South Transportation Planning Analysis Unit in Salem.
Kyle Alger with Metro. Garth Aponitis with DKS Associates.
Kenny Kloskis, also with DKS Associates.
Matt Gelato with WSP.
I'm a PhD student in urban studies at PSU.
I'm Steve Kelly with Washington County.
Natalie William Wall, ODOT.
Robert Shaboni, ODOT.
I'm Jeff Evans with ODOT.
Carol Richardson, engineering.
Okay, let's manage to do this on the phone. Let's see whether we can coordinate well enough to do it. It's a bit challenging. Why don't the folks just state your name and where you're from?
Ben Stabler, RSG.
Okay.
Carl McNair, City of Medford.
Alex Bettinardi, ODOT. Is my audio working?
Yes.
Eric Main, Oregon Health Authority.
Mark Harrington, RTC in Southwest Washington.
Joseph Off, City of Hillsborough.
So that's everybody. Okay, I think we're right on time. Let's get to our first presentation by Ray Jackson on the interagency emerging technology coordination. And of course, Ray or Raymond Jackson is a senior planner with the MW Mid-Willamette Valley Council of Government, which provides the staff for Salem, Kaiser area MPO, primarily on the MPO's long-range plan overseeing data and modeling work. Ray recently led OMSC's effort to understanding existing connected and autonomous vehicle modeling capacity in Oregon and to help coordinate future CAV modeling activity. With that, Ray, the floor is yours.
I'm going to stand over here just because see that. So good morning. I was asked to present some work that we did at the MPC, investigating current capabilities at the MPOs and ODOT on modeling connected and autonomous vehicles in Oregon. Okay. Cover why we did this, how we did it, what we found out, and then some of our next steps going forward. As you probably know, the OMSC is the Oregon Modeling Steering Committee, is composed of MPO and ODOT and Oregon agencies within the state of Oregon that are interested in modeling. We all know that developing models takes a long time, a lot of resources, and that connected and autonomous vehicles are a hot topic that everybody's talking about, including policymakers. So the OMSC wanted to know, could our current models address the CAV type related questions? Do we need to revise our current models, or do we build new ones? So the MPC, the Modeling Program Coordination Subcommittee of the OMSC, and I promise that will be it for all my long acronyms, we met in late 2017 and early 2018 to discuss this question, and we asked ourselves, what have the policymakers been asking staff and ODOT and whatnot, and what are they likely to ask in the future in regards to connected and autonomous vehicles? And most of the questions, of course, are about autonomous vehicles, but I'm going to use the same term. We came up with about 40 questions that the policymakers have been asking or likely to ask, and placed them in 6 categories, realizing that some of the more interesting questions we can't address with our current models or any sort of models, but we address those. We also have, at the MPOs and ODOT, 4 levels of models to look at transportation impacts and future uses, going from strategic models such as vision eval to our 4-step models used at the MPOs. ODOT has a statewide integrated model, and there's some microsimulation work here and there. And so for each of the questions we asked in regards to each of the tools, can they be modeled today? Do we need to do some future research, further research to implement something in the near term? Or do we have no modeling capabilities, or it's not available to be done with our current models? And we come up with the quintessential consumer reports type table showing, full circles represent that we can answer the questions today with our existing models. Empty circles mean we have a lot of work to do in the future. And when we summarize all this, we see that for the topics that we can model today with our existing tools, there's just a few of the questions that we can address with the tools that we use most, and that there are a larger number of questions that we could address going forward. Is that a question or a stretch? Stretch this way. There's a larger number of questions that we have no capability currently. That's mushing together all the ones that, about 8 to 10 topics that are outside the transportation realm. This could be used to identify future work for us ODOT, MPOs, or the research community. Especially in the near term, there should be a discussion or at the MPC at some point to discuss what are high priority topics to be researched from the future research, such as travel behavior changes. Those are ones that we could probably address, hopefully, with our current models, with either a little bit of tweaking or just rethinking of what's going on. And then realizing that not all our questions can be addressed in the future using a travel demand model. So as an example of the type of testing that has been going on and would go on in the future, Fair and Peers consulting firm had defined a set of scenarios back in 2017 or 18 that they took around to a number of MPOs on the country to test 4-step and ABM models in regards to CAVs. And these scenarios were actually tested by Portland Metro, and it was a discussion point for the MPC. So on the left, we have the scenarios that were defined by Fair and Peers, which address a specific hypothetical outcome of autonomous vehicles, such as the thought that because they will take you from home to work and then they can go back home, your parking cost would decrease. Or in the shared vision, they would continuously circle around picking up other people. In the middle column, we have what Portland Metro did for their sensitivity testing. And based on, you'd have to ask Aaron where they came up with the numbers. But the other MPOs and ODOT, we have yet to have a discussion about how we would do the testing. And with some of the new tools that are available, it might make sense to try different parameters than what Portland Metro did, because all our MPO models, all the 4-step models at least, are very similar, so we would expect similar results to what Portland Metro showed, which was essentially that for all the parameter metrics that they were showing, they increase, except for transit use, which decreases. And Fair and Peers also came up with the idea that if you tested all the first 6 scenarios together, that would represent AVs that are privately owned, like vehicles are today. And when you test all 7, that gets you more into the possible shared use scenarios. We have a lot of questions remaining on how to implement or test CAVs in our models. A lot of the work to date in research is when CAVs are roughly 100% of the fleet, and a lot of the interesting questions from a policy point of view are probably in the 0 to 50 before there's a lot of vehicles that are autonomous and can figure out things quicker than us humans can. The second question is, do our static assignments actually capture the nuances that AVs would provide in the system, or is this yet another good reason for everyone to move to dynamic assignment? We have all these unknowables, such as when the AVs will actually enter the fleet turnover, et cetera, that are outside our modeling capabilities that we can given. And we have the bigger issue to address more at a different level is models rely on surveys. Surveys rely on people telling us what they actually did. AVs are really what they're going to do in a new situation, so do we need to start thinking about stated preference as opposed to revealed preference surveys? And do the parameters that we get out of a revealed preference of what people have done, do they transfer over to the new future where everything is slightly, you're allowing 16-year-olds full mobility nowadays, or you're allowing people with can't drive lots more mobility than they have today. So the next steps are pretty much, I would say, the second one, at the MPC or wherever, further discussion how to test the MPO models and ODOT models to address CAVs. And it would be nice, hint, hint, Alex, if there was some sort of tool available that would look through all these plausible futures to develop a robust solution. That is foreshadowing. Questions? Yo.
So in the modeling, you deal with, so let's say that you have an autonomous car, electric, gas, and now you have multiple passengers, so go around with gravity. Is fueling in the model?
Yeah. So there's no, currently in the four-step models, there is no operations of the vehicle. Tara wants to add something, maybe, but you.
Well, I think the fuel come in two places in our current model, MOVE, right, which is a post-processor, to a traditional model, whether it's a four-step or an AVM. That's been a way to get vehicle choices in there, sort of, right, but post-processor really looking at link-level volumes, not so much in an individual household that might affect, say, the cost of the travel. So the other model that's tackling that right now is the strategic tool, the vision valve tool, and it actually takes a household, figures out how many vehicles they have, and then chooses individual vehicles, and then they base their own prices. But it doesn't have a lot of the other detail in terms of the network. So we have pieces, but that's, I would say that's all we have at this point.
Okay, I was just thinking in terms of you'll have less vehicles because you'll have these basically autonomous taxis, but then vehicles will be having to fuel more, so that I was thinking bottleneck fuel station.
Right, and so that would get into a different type of, you'd probably need a vehicle model that says you have, you go for so many minutes in the hour, and then you're not in service, right?
Right.
And so that would be one way of getting it, and I'm not sure, maybe Joe has more research bits out there about people taking, dealing with the specifics of vehicle operations in regard to how many passengers they can actually pick up, or whether, because we all assume that we start the hour or the day and the vehicle's going to last, that time period. So when it's part of a multi-hour event, then that would probably become more of an issue, especially if it's high mileage.
Yeah, the whole reason I'm asking is that I've been an electric vehicle mom for 18 years, and I'm on my third car. So as we move more towards electric vehicles,
yeah,
that they can self-charge over effective place. But there's ways to do that, but then you'll have that bottleneck and how you exploit that out. That kind of thing. There's going to be a country mess.
Right, and that might be outside the realm of our type of models into a different type of model, because that's a good policy question, but how does it get addressed?
And I think the micro simulation models could do that if you knew what the demand would be. If you could create a scenario, but our travel models typically feed those with the demand, and our travel models don't get at that right now. So.
Okay. That's just kind of
good question.
I have a question. In the graph where Metro has their options off the table, the parking one.
Hold on. It's somebody who knows what's going on with it. That one?
Yeah. Oh, so the column in Portland Metro is what we found out, or the assumption they made?
The assumptions they made.
So why would you, for parking costs, down by half?
It was high.
Well,
I mean, these are all arbitrarily chosen, and so ask Aaron or Chris or Kyle. Don't have to.
I wasn't involved on this.
And so I brought around, Yeah, it's a hypothesis, and, you know, with AVs, a lot of these hypotheses are built on speculation and no data. So,
Because they're gonna share?
because they're going to share,
yeah,
because they're going to go out.
It's a drop-off.
It's a drop-off, and they go back home, or if it's a shared one, they keep circling around forever. And it's like the freeway capacity, right? They're saying increase freeway capacities by 65%. Maybe. There's a HCM pool study going on now to look at capacity adjustment factors. They are not, don't think they're going that high. There are other studies, you know, discussions that, especially in the under 90% autonomous vehicle fleet, you really probably can't do that because we still have traffic laws that are built for humans, and our reaction time is crappier than the computers, so you wouldn't see that as much. Of course, then you have people who drive in LA, which throws everything off, so we'll see.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Why don't we move on to Nick's presentation, and then we will have about 10 minutes for discussion to panelists. So I believe their presentation will be very logistic. Meltzer is a licensed engineer with a master's degree in planning. Nick enjoys focus on a complex relationship between land use and transportation. As the lead and only full-time staff for Ballast MPO, is actively engaged in all activities, developing work to facilitate policy board meetings. Nick is OMSC's designated emerging tech topic lead.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about how the Emerging Technology Group came to be and what we're working on. I'm an engineer, but I'm not a modeler, so be nice to me with your questions, please. So, you know, you don't have to look very hard to see that, you know, at least last year, everyone was talking about emerging technology, whether it's, we've got autonomous freight, we've got connected vehicles, we've got, what else is there? Phone apps and all sorts of stuff. And so at the fall meeting, fall OMSC meeting last year, I had just come back from the NACDO conference in LA, and kind of the big message that I heard there was like, whether or not cities, MPOs, and states are ready, like this stuff is coming, and it's like gonna come. And so at the meeting, there was some discussions about a desire to study kind of emerging technology, and I was new enough and dumb enough to volunteer to lead that effort. And so I kicked that off last fall and been working with Alex Bentonardi on the phone there, and then Ray too, to kind of move forward with that. So we had our first meeting earlier this year, and we're technically kind of like a chapter or an ad hoc group under the Technical Tools Subcommittee. And we're looking at connected vehicles, autonomous vehicles, ride-hailing, scooters, and anything else that comes up that we haven't thought of yet. But we're not kind of focusing on legislation. You know, that was kind of like a very clear intention that, you know, we're open to, you know, seeing what potential legislation is coming and how that could be modeled, but we're not kind of going the other way. And then in terms of anything else, I don't know if anyone saw this, but Uber is now running helicopters too. And that was a short side note. That was a discussion in LA about, you know, if you're starting to think about drones and you know, vertical infrastructure, that we don't even have the vertical infrastructure mapped. And so in order to kind of get ready for like this advent of drones, and if you're going to regulate them, we need to start with the fact that we need to need a 3D Google map or a 3D map of the world, which or cities, which is a pretty interesting thing to think about. So we've kind of wound up being pretty interdisciplinary, which has been fun. So we've got folks from ODOT, TPOW, the Office of Innovation, and Transportation Planning. We have representation from 3 universities. My MPO, Central Lane MPO, has participated, and then the 2 councils of governments. And so kind of what I would call a perfect storm of modelers and policy wonks. It's kind of all coalesced that Alex will talk about, the TMIP EMAT work, but there's this activity-based model that's being developed at ODOT. There's the TMIP EMAT work. There's what Ray talked about. At the same time, the Oregon Highway Plan is planned to be updated next year. And so there's also, every year there's been potential for state preemptive legislation, mostly on ride-hailing, but there's also federal efforts focused on piloting and potentially implementing CAVs in some states. And so we're just trying to, get a handle on what's happening. And then once we get a handle on what's happening, think about, can we model what potentially might happen? And so the first step in that has just been kind of to understand the field, and that was kind of one of our main tasks, we would say, kind of in establishing the group, is what's going on out there, who's talking about it, what are they saying? And so we kind of have an Excel spreadsheet that we're kind of continuing to build as new stuff comes out. We've got 34 resources on emerging technology, and that really, spans the field of modeling all the way to cities have already established some kind of policy goals or regulatory ideas with the advent of emerging technology. We organize them into 4 categories. So policy, regulatory, evaluation, and scenario. As I mentioned, it's a living resource. And the organization becomes important kind of on the next slide, is as Alex kind of worked through the TMIP EMAT work that he's going to talk about, part of that was thinking about, what are the potential bounds that we want to measure with the model. So, is, the question about parking, being half the cost, is that realistic? What are other people talking about? Is parking going to go away completely? Are we going to have need more parking? What's going to happen with travel lanes, curb regulation, transit, and anything else? And so we did a second version of that spreadsheet, and I think we talked about trying to get them online somewhere so folks could obviously have a look at those. But looking at those impacts, so then from those impacts, or what people are thinking are going to be the impacts, Alex can then develop policy levers to use in the modeling process. So then we can say, here's what everyone's saying may happen, here's what we did, or here's the lever that we changed in the model, and then here's the potential impact. And that again leads back to the kind of the Oregon Highway or Oregon Transportation Plan update next year. They kind of want to start to get a handle on what are the potential scenarios that could happen as we think 5, 10, 20 years into the future. So I got really excited about putting this in my presentation this morning. I don't think anyone says transportation is like politics, but this is an old quote from Donald Rumsfeld. So there's no knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns, which gets really confusing. But I thought it made sense because, we kind of have these conversations, we meet and we talk about, well, we think this might happen, but also we don't know what we don't know, so other stuff could happen, and how do we kind of account for that? And then kind of from, from my perspective, the policy perspective, how do you anticipate, what might happen with policies and either prevent it from happening or kind of slow it down from happening if it's potentially negative. So moving forward, we're meeting in 2 weeks and we're talking about, what we're going to look at over the next 12 months. So as I mentioned, somewhat in preparation for the update to the highway plan. We have got a participant from Transportation Planning, Adam Argo, who's been joining us at our meetings. It's to help with the TMIP EMAT work, and then also focusing on activity-based model. And then another reason why I kind of, volunteered to lead the effort is I wrote in a white paper on emerging technology into my work plan this year. And so with any luck, that should kind of tee up the white paper. And then we'll be providing regular updates to OMSC at their biannual meetings. And that's all I have. Any questions? Yeah, I mean, your resources, you can email them to me and we'll add them to the list too. Yeah.
My question is about, I guess, policy side. You mentioned it a little bit in your presentation. I'm wondering if the panel is looking at anything with regard to, like, on the supply side, in terms of infrastructure that might be needed from cities to coexist with the CVAV emerging technologies that are on the demand side that we see. But I'm wondering how, if the panel's looking at how cities can and what would be required from an infrastructure standpoint to better accommodate those as well, whether it be variable messaging signs that the vehicle can pick up, adapt to, or interactive freeway loop detectors. I mean, just from the infrastructure and information side, what should cities be ready to dole out if they want to embrace this technology? Have you guys looked into any of that?
I think that's where we're heading.
Okay.
And so, I mentioned we're developing our work plan. We're kind of at this initial stage of, saying what might happen, and then narrowing that down to what do we want to measure, and then from there, looking at, based on what we measure, what are the impacts? And then I guess, that fourth question would be, based on the impacts, what do cities want to do to either encourage the behavior, discourage the behavior, or accommodate it?
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Hey, Nick. Thanks. Thanks for doing all the work too. I look forward to the spreadsheet and white paper. Now you're on the clock. I was wondering, in your scan so far, if you could share any tidbits on any places that are trying to sort of get ahead of the game in terms of equity impacts. And I'm thinking in two ways: equity both across modes. So, some modes in some of these supply changes might be at kind of a disadvantage, non-motorized modes in particular. Heard a little about transit, and then also on the on the more traditional sort of socioeconomic equity side. Have you seen anyone grappling that ahead of time before it starts spinning?
It's been really interesting. The literature is just all over the map, and there's no one. We haven't seen any city reports that are city or state reports that we found that are, I'd say welcoming the infrastructure. No one said, we want it, this is what we're doing to bring it to us or to accommodate it. The city of Seattle, 2 or 3 years ago now, kind of set out some policy goals to address, regardless of connected autonomous vehicles, this is what we want, our citywide goals to be. And then, this is how we're going to respond. We're going to respond and, with those goals when it comes time to regulate or to non-regulate them. There's been the city stuff on the goals. Nelson Nygaard did a paper on the benefits or how autonomous transit could help, drastically lowering the cost of transit. And then, it's interesting. None of the literature we found would really make a call on whether or not this was going to happen. So as we tried to say, what's the timeline?
Yeah.
There's no clear consensus on it. All the literature just says this might happen, or this might happen, or this might happen.
It's kind of where we are.
Yeah.
But, sometimes it's good to get ahead of the game because someone else will figure out what happens to you. I think as we've seen in other realms with technology. So, yeah.
And I think it's happening faster than the literature can probably keep up with too.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned the Uber thing. They're running helicopters in New York City, and I saw plans that they're looking to do some sort of what they're calling a mobility hub somewhere in Texas, where you would scoot or bike to a mobility hub and then hop on a helicopter. And so it's just really interesting. I think it's a fun time to be involved in transportation. So.
Definitely, yeah. Thanks.
Yeah.
And do we have questions for either Nick and Ray? Or is there a question from the online audience? Ray, I have a question for you. Is when you assess the adequacy of different for different impacts, various impacts, how do you do that assessment? Whether existing tools will be sufficient?
It was a group discussion, so everyone was asked to say, you know, given their expertise in a different set of tools,
right,
how well it would address the questions, and then we had a group discussion to see if that made sense, and then we had a second discussion to make sure that everyone agreed that everyone's assessment was. So it was professional judgment.
Delphi.
Yeah, Delphi.
Okay.
Modified.
Okay.
So. Did you model them individually, or were they all kind of
no,
pushed together as one?
They were nothing was modeled per se except for you got what Metro did. So when we're looking at the questions, everyone was supposed to look at. Here's a question on. Well, that's a boring one. Change in mode preferences, okay? And then, you know, does vision eval help us do that today? And that answer that sort of question today, yes, no. Can the 4-step models do it? Can the Southern Oregon ABM do it? So each one they were individually.
I think I was more interested in Metro.
Okay.
The work that Aaron.
You're supposed to do, Farron Pierce said, you know, you do each one individually,
okay,
and then you have the 2 extra scenarios where you combine the first 6 and then all of them. And that's where you get his table, which you all can see on the phone here perfectly. And, you know, it shows that surprise, you know, if you increase freeway capacity, VHT and VMT, well, VMT goes up, you know, and then when you combine everything together, things go up or not.
Yeah, I was curious about this.
Yeah, and so that is something that we, you know, as we go forward with all the other MPO and ODOT models, we can maybe try different parameters or use Alex's new fun tool.
But, and maybe to reinforce Ray's point a bit, and kind of what Joe was saying, it's hard, right? So, you know, one person makes an assumption, and that's what gets plugged into the model. And, you know, we've been having these conversations with the emerging tech group. It's like, well, is this an assumption that we're comfortable with making? Like, are we making an assumption for, you know, the Oregon Transportation Plan? Like, are we setting policy, or do we take policy and then implement it in the model? And it gets pretty gray. You know, you can't test everything. You kind of just have to, like, pick somewhere in the middle, or pick, you know, some upper bounds, and then try and say, based on this is what could happen. Based on this might happen.
We're in the learning phase, so nothing is actual or known.
Right.
You just have to test things and play the whack-a-mole game and see what happens.
Yeah, because humans don't actually do what we keep thinking they should be doing, as we prove with all our models, right?
Any more questions before I speak? If there's no more questions for them, I can certainly have more questions towards the end. We are a few minutes ahead. Let's move on to Alex's presentation. I think Nick has alluded a lot of Alex's work, so to that. So Alex will talk about TIMIP EMAT, or Exploratory and Analysis Tool. And for Alex Bettinardi is a Senior Integrated Analysis Engineer for ODOT, working for ODOT for the last 14 years. He holds bachelor's and master's degree in Transportation Engineer from University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and is a registered professional engineer in Oregon. Alex chairs OMS's Technical Tools Subcommittee. Over the last several years, he has been working to incorporate and test transportation changes around automated vehicle and other emerging technologies. With that, Alex, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Leming. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
And you're seeing my screen? You're seeing the lead page for the presentation?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So, let's see. I'm sorry, I'm working on it. There we go. So this is the agenda I plan to cover here. Giving some context around what we were doing with the team at BMAT and the motivations. It's going to be a continuation off of what Nick and Ray were already discussing. And then, I'll probably spend a little bit more time in that section, and then I can give everyone just a kind of a quick taste for what the design process and the development of the team at BMAT tool looks like, and then hopefully spend some time on looking at and talking about the experience with the tool and the modeling runs and the information that we gathered from that work, and then leave some time for questions. So, building on what Ray and Nick said, the motivations for this work were around understanding what the potential is around emerging technologies and the uncertainty that exists there. And the OMSC has been scoping to test emerging technologies with the newly developed ABM. Just as some quick context here, the ABM is a CT ramp pivot off of San Diego's estimation. It's linked with the Zoom for assignment, and it's for the Southern Oregon area. But for these tests, we wanted something a little bit more urban than the Southern Oregon area, so we cranked up the population to around 500,000 people, just to get kind of a higher level, a larger metro areas level of congestion. And the tool runs in about 4 to 5 hours. So at around the end of 2018, we were discussing this Fair and Peers table that Ray presented, and the plan was to move forward with testing those, 6 or 8, depending on how you want to count, Fair and Peers scenarios. And then in December 2018, TMIP EMAT gave a webinar on their tool, TMIP EMAT, which I forget, did I have that anywhere yet? Sorry, I'm just throwing around that acronym without explaining it. So TMIP is the Transportation Modeling Improvement Program. And I hate that the tool is the combination of the two. It should just be EMAT, but they coined it as TMIP EMAT. So Transportation Modeling Improvement Program, and then underneath that is the Exploratory Modeling Analysis Tool, EMAT. And so they presented a webinar on this new tool, which seems to offer all of the capabilities for testing tools in a large variety of ways, similar to how we wanted to test tools around emerging technology. And so it was going to do so much more than just running 6 or 8 scenarios and filling the table. And so it seemed to be the tool to facilitate exactly what the OMSC wanted to do with around the ABM. So at that time, we kind of took a pause on running the Fair and Peers scenarios, which were kind of geared more towards trip-based models, maybe anyways, or at least the comparison to what Metro did would have been a trip-based ABM comparison. And for the time being, we took a pause, and we were going to explore and see what we could do with TMIP EMAT, and then maybe come back to the Fair and Peers work as needed. So when we saw the webinar, the intent was just to use TMIP EMAT off the shelf. But then in February, we learned that Sarah Sun was offering a beta tester application process, and so ODOT applied to be a beta tester for TMIP EMAT since we were planning on doing it anyways, and we were approved, and so we got a bunch of free resources free to us. I mean, everyone paid via the federal gas tax, but free to ODOT resources from Cambridge Systematics. And so they helped us deploy it, which probably would have been, in hindsight, very difficult. And I was naive to think that I would just take it down from GitHub and start applying it without any support. So we were successful with that support. So this is the workflow, and I'm going to use this slide a couple of times just to kind of remind you where we are. And so the next thing I'm going to talk to, so I'm transitioning from talking about the motivations, and I'm going to transition to talking about developing the scope, which is really the design experiment, and then the model, and then the analysis. So this slide, if you get, if you take away one or two things from my discussion, please take away this slide. I was so impressed, and maybe this is obvious to some people in the room. It wasn't obvious to me, but there was a RAND Corporation process that they started with for laying out how do you even think about this space. And so, back in 2018, like the Fair and Pierce work, I think it wasn't informed by this thought process, and I think this thought process is the way to approach it, and that's the way we've been going with it through the emerging tech conversation. So step one, before you think about what you're testing, step one is to think about the goals. What are you trying to achieve? What do you need? What do you want your urban area to look like? And then the next step is to think about, okay, for achieving that goal, what policy levers are at my hand, or would I be able to maybe get access to through other jurisdictions or a legislative process to achieve the goals that I'm looking for. The next step is to identify what uncertainties that I don't have power over that could blindside me and ruin my goals. What are those things out there? And then lastly, what are the metrics? How am I going to know that I'm achieving my goals? How am I measuring outcomes to make sure that I've successfully hit my goals? And so again, please remember, like this one slide, this is how we should be doing all of our work, just emerging tech. I was really impressed with this. It's simple in hindsight, it's like, duh, I guess, but I don't know. It's not the way I always approach it. So in this design, step one is not thinking about levers, right? It's thinking about the goal. In this beta test, and I guess maybe I should just back up for just a second. We were hoping to timeline it out so that the OMSC group would be at the table for this beta test, and we would have a large Oregon group that would be there putting their thought into what are these goals, what are these policies, what are these uncertainties, what are these measures. The timing didn't work out for the March kickoff meeting that we had to get this, this free support off the ground. And so it was kind of an solo initial run through on the beta test in this design, with the idea that after we kind of proof concept. Okay, great. I'm being recorded again. I'm glad I paused. Okay. So ODOT went ahead to create this proof of concept design with Cambridge, with the idea that we would come back with the OMSC and do a bigger, better, fully peer-reviewed kind of design. So just to get something started, this is the goal that ODOT was working from, to provide an equitable and accessible transportation system for all income groups. And so then from that point, we had to think about, okay, what policy levers can we move? And for this beta test, what policy levers can we code into the tool we want to test? So it's not a full set of policy levers, but what we code into the tool to test, and also what are the next step after policy levers, or what are the areas of uncertainty that we feel like we can code at this initial beta test? Again, thinking that we can probably do a better set after we have a larger discussion with the OMSC and the Oregon community, and more experience with the tool. And so what we landed on was the 4 policy levers on the left. We attempted to do a transit everywhere lever. So the transit authority would have the budget to have little on-demand shuttles moving around. like a public version of a TNC, a cheaper version of a TNC. The way we coded it up was you could pay per mile, or per a flat rate like transit is, and so we opted for this test to have a flat rate. So you pay your $2, you get to go anywhere in the region. We had a lever around transit level of service, and the idea was that this lever, it basically is a time bonus or a time penalty depending on how it swings. But the idea is you basically are perceiving this transit service, whether it's traditional transit or transit everywhere, more favorably. The bus smells less like pee, or you get to do work on it, or it's cheaper, whatever it is that makes you feel like you've got getting a better ride. So that's what that level of service is supposed to be. We also had the policy lever of playing with parking rates. And then there was a policy lever around basically allowing for micromobility, and the way we represented that was through various active mode speed increases. So walking would be increased by electric scooters, and biking would be increased by electric bikes. And so then areas of uncertainty, and these are kind of the same from the modeling's perspective. Areas of uncertainty and levers are both just inputs to the model. It's just a categorization of whether or not you feel like you have control over it, or you feel like you do not have control over it from a policy perspective. And so freeway capacity, that's really about whether companies deploy technology that allows for more vehicles to, higher densities on freeways. And so, it's something that happens to us, I think. And I guess you could debate any of these. Auto operating cost is about, it's a little bit about policy, because it's about what we charge people to drive, but historically we don't charge people very much to drive. And so it's more about what's the fuel that people are using, what are they paying, to operate their vehicle or possibly to buy into a vehicle. Is their ride subsidized by advertising? And then we also wanted to test something around economic conditions, and that got really complicated with what's the job mix, how do household demographics change with different job mixes, and a bunch of other factors. And so we ended up just throttling income up or down to say that basically your buying power is either better or worse in these scenarios. And lastly, we ended up we tried to do something around household density. It ended up failing for this beta test, and so it went away. So then on the metric side, we had this dream list of all the amazing things we could pull out of an ABM, and we hit cold hard reality pretty quick, where this is kind of a criticism of model development in general, but the model was developed by model developers who are interested in making sure that the model functions correctly through time and or through the steps, and not necessarily by the user who needs to answer a bunch of questions using the model. And so as we started to try and dig in and pull out information from the ABM, it quickly became obvious that all of the information, like about household decisions and trip attributes and choices that were going into how people were making trip choices, basically in my mind, a fully augmented household survey, all of that was not readily available to pull out a bunch of cool measures. And so one of the initial lessons learned from this process was the development work that needs to occur on the modeling side to get the right measures out of the tool. But so for the beta test, we hit cold hard reality and kind of fell back on more standard measures like your BMT and your mode splits and your, we had auto ownership as a proxy for this. So that was a great lesson learned right off the bat. Because we haven't taken the EBM out on the road yet for actual scenario work and policy work, and so knowing that we need a bunch of work to get measures out that we really want is great to know before you start using the tool for real. So that was good. Okay, so I talked about the scope, and I don't know if I should be pausing for questions. I don't know if people want to ask questions in here, but the next part is talking about model development and running the model. The model being TMIP EMAT, not the ABM. This is the ABM, just a context for how it runs. The ABM is, we're looking at the folder structure, and basically you get the folder structure together copy the folder structure for a given scenario, you update the inputs, and you run the bat file. It's a pretty clean run process. So copy, update inputs, run bat file. And so that made the connection to TMIP EMAT relatively simple. Cambridge's terminology is that you've got TMIP EMAT, which is its own tool. You've got your core model, which is in this case the ABM, which is its own tool. And then you have this API connection between TMIP EMAT and the core model. And so when you're applying TMIP EMAT, you don't change TMIP EMAT code. That's all standard, a standard set of tools to use across the tool, modeling tool in the country. You don't change your core model. What you change is the connection points between how your core model feeds information to and from TMIP EMAT. And so that involves basically Python functions, a setup, a run, a post-process, an archive, and then an output parser. And, because the ABM run process is simple, those steps were pretty simple. So setup was simply copy a blank directory, update, or write a CSV of the scenario parameters specified by TMIP EMAT, run a script to update the inputs based on the design for the given scenario that you're running. Then there's the run function, which simply runs that bat file. So then, and I guess I haven't given the context of, so TMIP EMAT is running a couple dozen scenarios, in this case 70, and it chooses those 70 scenarios to explore the entire lever space, the uncertainty space. The way they have it set up right now is that, and they're looking to change this potentially so that the user has some control, but right now it's defaulted at you need to run at least 10 scenarios per lever, and that isn't like clean scenarios. Like some people get confused that these scenarios are like, okay, lever 1 is on and all the other levers are off, and lever 2 is on and all the levers. So it's not like that. So it's a Latin hypercube design, which is an impressive word that I can't explain, or phrase that I can't explain, so don't ask me to. But basically, what it does is it chooses a set of lever configurations that allows you to fully represent the entire space with as minimal runs as possible, or minimal scenarios as possible. And so each of these 70 scenarios is a combination of all of the 7 levers that we had at different positions in their range. And so TMIP EMAT designs all that, and then you have to feed back that design for each scenario that you're going to run back to the ABM, and so that's what's happening in setup. And then so setup is given, okay, I'm running scenario 3, and that has the 7 levers configured in these ways, and so change the inputs based on these configurations, and then it runs. There's a post-processor function which runs an R script to process the ABM output files to create the TMIP-specific set of output files to feed back to TMIP EMAT. And in this case, the way TMIP EMAT works is wants a single value for every output. You can have hundreds of outputs. So if you want like VMT by functional class or something, you can have 7 values for VMT for every functional class, but those are 7 specific outputs in TMIP EMAT. So a post-processor creates the outputs that you want. There's an archive process that simply copies the ABM run directory for that scenario into a folder directory, so you can go back and pull more outputs if you need to later. And then there's a parser which takes those output files for TMIP EMAT and brings them into the TMIP EMAT working environment, basically. So that's what the run process looks like for TMIP EMAT. Again, it's running the ABM, but in a very intelligent, orchestrated way for a certain number of scenarios to explore the entire problem space. And so that run process was, even without turning on TMIP EMAT, was amazing in its own, just because those 70 runs were so much more informative than the original calibration work that we had done. I think we were fairly unique that in the calibration work that we did for the ABM, we built in 3 sensitivity tests during our peer review to test the ABM under typical a set of typical applications that we expected to use the ABM for. But those 3 tests didn't expose all of the potential issues that this much larger set of tests did. So even if you weren't going to use TMIP-EMAT for policy analysis, I think at a minimum, just to bend and twist your model before you use it, it's invaluable. That was a huge lesson learned for us, and plan for us to move it going forward. The little picture on the slide just shows that we were getting, one of the key things that we found is we were getting some results that didn't make any sense, and we later found that our method of successive averaging in between ABM iterations wasn't working, and so this is showing a case where I found a very congested zone that if I choked it and reduced the capacity to that zone even more, the demand went up, and what we found was that between iterations, the first ABM iteration, the demand would be really high, which it would make the congestion skyrocket. That skyrocketed congestion would then make the demand really low, which would make congestion no longer exist, which would then on the third iteration, which was our final iteration at the top, demand would then swing, potentially higher than it was in the first iteration. And so that's why we were getting this case where if we had really congested zones, they were just getting more congested, or more demand, even when you would expect a highly congested zone to get less demand. And so that allowed us to correct the method of successive averaging that was occurring between iterations, and also informed us that we needed to increase the number of iterations that was occurring in the ABM. A great thing to discover before you take your model out on the road for actual use. Another big issue that was identified with this testing was that our transit everywhere was too simplified. Another thing that's great to know before you take your model out on the road. And so I guess I would just say at this point that any results that we look at, just be aware that, this is definitely a beta. No one should take away any policy epiphanies that they might see in the results, because, there's still, we still don't believe that the results are correct. And one of the things you will see if we start to look at results is that transit everywhere does a huge shift away from auto to transit, like 40% shift to the transit mode. That plummets VMT and VHT. But what's happening is that when we model transit, it's simplified in that we don't worry about the congestion that's added when you add a bus onto the highway. We don't intermingle our bus assignment with our highway assignment. And so when we applied transit everywhere, it allowed everyone to jump on a door-to-door service that was super cheap and a decent travel time without adding any congestion to the system. So those were phantom vehicles. They didn't actually get assigned onto the system. So of course VMT plummeted, and then the system was also unconstrained from a fleet perspective. We didn't worry about how many shuttles it would take to serve the huge demand. And so we had an issue of both not representing the fleet that it would take to serve the number of people, and we didn't represent the congestion that would occur from all of the heading and just those trips in themselves. And so, away from this is you can't do public TNC testing the way we did. And so, again, great lessons to learn before you use it for a live project. So now I have pretty TMIP-EMAT visuals. I guess that's my timeline, Fleming. And should I take questions, or any questions before I show visuals?
How long do you need? Do you think you would need for the demo?
Maybe just 5. I just want to kind of highlight some of the pretty pictures that come out. So maybe like 5 minutes.
Okay. Yeah. just go ahead. Maybe we
Okay.
just have a shorter Q&A.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Sounds good. So Team at PMAT is in Jupyter Notebook. This Jupyter Notebook. This is showing the scope definition, which shows the uncertainties that were put in, the levers, and then the measures that we were looking at. One thing you do, it's not really Team at PMAT. So Team at PMAT designs all the dots, but these initial figures aren't really Team at PMAT. They're just looking at for every performance measure across all the levers, where did the 70 scenarios fall? And so you can just kind of quickly see for every measure, how was my lever, impacting, or how did those 70 dots, fall on the map? And so this is just showing ABM output. This isn't Team at PMAT magic. This is just ABM outputs. And for a lot of it, it's clouds, but in some of them, you can see a clear trend, like here for person miles traveled, auto operating cost has a clear impact on the number of person miles traveled. Some of them are cloudier, which shows there isn't much of a strong relationship between that measure and that lever, which is good information as well. And that whole this endless set of dots, which could probably make your eyes bleed, is also represented in this figure, which is telling you basically the same thing, it's a lot quicker. It's showing you for all the levers on the horizontal and all the measures on the vertical, that the yellow boxes are showing you which lever is the most influential for a given measure. And so you can see that like incomes is very influential for the number of autos owned and the percent of non-mandatory tours. Transit everywhere dominates as the most influential lever, but that's because, like I was mentioning, you've got a bunch of phantom cars that don't create congestion. So I guess maybe that's Nick was talking about, the Uber has helicopters for almost free scenario where all the on-demand goes up in the air and you get to travel without impacting the system, I guess. So anyways, a really quick way to look at how the levers are impacting the measures. And then, so here's where we start to get into the power of Team at PMAT. So Team at PMAT uses those 70 scenarios and builds a cloud of, in this case, I think 5,000 virtual ABM runs. And so here you can see the exact same of plots, except the orange dots are actual runs and the blue dots are simulated ABM runs. So I didn't have to run my ABM 5,000 times, but I got pretty good information about how the ABM would project these outcomes to occur under different lever configurations. And that's what Team at EMAT is using in visuals, is these meta models built off of ABM results. And I didn't show it all, but as you're building all these, Team at EMAT gives you the ability to sense the quality of these meta models and to make a judgment call on whether or not you feel that they're good enough and whether or not you feel like you should trust them. And so, without trying to keep this somewhat a manageable timeline, I would just say that. So now we're starting to get into Team at PMAT a little bit, where start to use your slider bars to explore if you wanted to set, if you wanted to look at certain configurations of levers, you could see how they impact that cloud of 5,000 dots. That one's not reacting, but these, you could start to see how the lever configurations show up in the different outputs, and you could choose. One way to look at this is choosing levers to seeing how it impacts outputs, but another way to look at it is choosing outputs and seeing what your lever positions need to look like in order to achieve those outputs. And it's a place where you can set outputs, lever throttles, and another way to look at that is through the analysis. In this case, if we wanted to reduce VHT, auto hours traveled, and we had like a threshold, and we wanted to be below a certain threshold, that one of the Team of PMAT tools allows you to explore the space. And so in this case, if we do nothing, 40% of all of the scenarios achieve this goal of being below 260,000 hours traveled for the region. You can see with one move here, just turning transit everywhere onto true, we've gone from 40% to almost 80% of the cases are meeting that threshold. And just using this exercise, you can see if you now add auto operating costs, or if you increase auto operating costs, you continue to improve your VH as we go up and try and cover more and more of the space. Let's see, at some point we'll add another, we're just increasing auto operating costs here. Now we're starting to increase parking rates. So this is the quickest way to get at that threshold. If you want to minimize hours traveled, this shows you the kind of the best way to get there to maximize or to minimize kind of the things that you're impacting to achieve that goal. This is kind of just another interactive plot to show how you could select certain parts of a given trend and see how it, go back to the plots above and see how they play out. And I would try and do that a little bit more if I had some more time. And I think part of the problem is I got a bunch of things open and I don't think they're reacting quite the way I want them to. The last thing here is that with the meta models, so this page I was showing here is just looking at the 5,000 dots and exploring the information that's provided. Team of PMAT also provides the ability to use the meta models and do a neural network search where you're running the meta models in such a way to optimize onto a solution, and you can set the number of iterations that you want to run in order to achieve the optimized solution that you're looking for. In this case, it was 5,000, and you can look for a place where the curve flattens out. Maybe we should, in this case, more scenarios could be run. But in this case, what this is attempting to do is go through the meta models and find a scenario where you've optimized on all the levers. So, you've optimized the outputs using your levers. And so it's saying, if I want to optimize my outputs, what combination of levers gets me, the best mix of outputs. And so you can interact with this graph a little bit to just get a sense for, okay, if this is where I want to be, if I'm up here with my transit mode, what options do I have as far as my for my levers to get me there? And similarly, you can do the same thing with uncertainties. You can say, okay, if I want to achieve a certain bike walk, well, it's not. If I want to achieve a certain VMT, what are the combinations of things that of uncertainties that I need to be aware of and guard myself against? So in this case, we're looking at how uncertainties impact the output measures, and then lastly, just those we're looking at combinations of levers and uncertainties, and also you can create more complex functions to say, well, I want to look at a tailored set of elements I want to focus on and optimize for, and a similar functionality can be used to. And here you can see that it leveled out fairly quickly to focus in on a set of specific levers or uncertainties to get at that specific set of outcomes that a policy group might be looking for. I think I'll pause there. I've probably gone over time already.
Whether there is a couple questions for Joe before we transition for Alex.
I can't answer them. Alex, I have one quick one. That was a great point you raised about being careful when you start pulling levers and models and into areas they weren't really designed for. Is anything built into the EMAT system that sort of warns you when it finds one of these kind of odd sensitivities in your model structure, or is that up to you to kind of examine the output?
Yeah. So again, I don't know if I would have been successful without Cambridge's support, but one of the things that we were looking at in order to determine whether or not we had a successful model was some of the fit statistics that were coming out. And I probably won't be able to explain it as well as Cambridge or quickly enough. But basically, these meta models are being developed to get quick stats on how well they are representing the outcomes. And we went through this. I didn't go through the full detail, but we went through a series of iterations of TMF-EMAT where we ran it once for a bunch of scenarios and said, oh, that doesn't look good. And we ran it once again, and we still had issues. And in each case, we were getting poor fit here, and that poor fit kind of immediately, as opposed to just running with the analytics and saying, okay, we nailed it. This screen would give us reason to pause and go back and say, are we missing something? Is our model broken? In each case that we had a horrible looking, disgusting fit, it was something was grossly wrong, and we went back and took care of it.
Cool.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Joe, I think we should transition to your presentation. We have time. Joe Broach. Joe will talk about from at least one week of work from an academic point of view of how we do research on emerging technology. And Joe Broach is a senior researcher modeler at Portland Metro and a research associate instructor in urban studies planning at Portland State. Just research on bicycle and pedestrian network and choice modeling has been widely published and NCHRP guidance. Recently has been active in research on emerging mobility options and their impact on urban transportation system and equity. With that, Joe, take over.
Thanks, Sidney. I feel like there's a certain honesty into the order of our presentations today too. How they all fit together so neatly, except we start by mapping out the policy space and building the models and paying consultants, and then like 2 years later at the end we get the research we needed at the beginning to make decisions, and then we repeat it, so I think it makes sense, but here I am, and I think this all leads nicely into some we've got a lot of questions, and I think what Nick said is true. It's an exciting time. It's an interesting time. I was talking with a colleague of mine, Cindy Patterson, who's been doing regional modeling, before I knew step one of the 4-step model, and even she struggles to think of a time when we had something like this on the horizon that seemed plausible that it's actually going to happen. Some of these emerging technologies and modes, but also that we could even add on to Rumsfeld, say we have uncertain uncertainties, about our modeling capabilities to even deal with these. We're very uncomfortable with just plopping in the expected time and cost of an autonomous transit vehicle and running with it, right? And so I think I'm gonna strive not to become one of those people that comes up with a rule of thumb. I'm gonna present some numbers, but take them all as they're very. It's very much initial. Now, one thing that is true is I don't know how it happened, but it fell into my hands. I don't know how it ended up at a toy store this weekend, but I actually got my hands on a scale model of Google's autonomous vehicle set to launch next year, and my kid is loving it. So I guess everyone's going to go for them. So the focus today is based on some work that I did with Li Ming and also with Wajie, who's here from Portland State. And it's funny that I do all this work in big and emerging data sources, but really, as Ray said, there's nothing out there yet on a lot of this, right? And so to get at it, we kind of had to fall back on some pretty, what felt like some pretty old techniques, which was very in a carefully constructed sort of setting, asking people what they would do if they're presented with some range of these new scenarios. And so for today, I'm just going to focus on a few things that I would say these are questions we were able to ask of the data more than they are model results. But some of those questions are ones you've seen thrown around today, are probably bubbling in your head, and those are things like, are these emerging options really going to be more compelling than existing modes, just leaving aside any advantages they might have in time or cost or whatever? Surely they're going to be marketed that way, and in a lot of these scenarios we're kind of giving the benefit of the doubt that they're just going to be perceived as superior in different ways. But is that true? And so, you want to put people in as real a setting as you can and see what choices they make. We're also going to look a little bit at sort of what we can say about the who, the where, and the when of people switching to emerging modes. So, built into this is we're at some semblance of an equilibrium now, and we've got this fuzzy version of a future up here, and in between with new technologies is always really complicated to understand how we're going to get from A to B. And I think we can at least start to think about, who the winners and losers will be, where the quicker shifts might happen, where things might be slower to change, which, it doesn't get marketed, but it's important to know for policy outcomes and sensitivity. And finally, I think, again, an honest ordering of things, right? Then at the end, if we have time, we think about equity, right? I should have put that as number one and stepped my way through, but oh well, I'm not learning from my own mistakes. So I want to just set the stage here. When I was talking about emerging modes, these were emerging modes, I guess, a couple of years ago. Some still are, some aren't, and some are out of the picture. It's funny to see Car2Go down there leaving a lot of markets when we were, we were thinking of it as something emerging. I think floating car share will still be around a while, but it's interesting. So these were the modes that we were looking at, and this is leading up to my explanation of some stated choice experiments we did. So we had to bound the space, right? We couldn't have every potential future combination out there, but we were looking at two kind of segments. The self-driving, which is obviously a little bit more, is fuzzier to people. Very few people have had experience with getting a self-driving car outside of like riding around a closed course in a conference center. So we did look at that, and we looked at it though in the sense of ride-hailing self-driving or autonomous vehicles, right? So not one that you own at home, but one that you call up. It's basically a driverless Uber or Lyft with its characteristics. We thought about that in terms of being a shared vehicle, right? So that it picks you up and no one else, but then it picks someone else up, or a shared ride situation where it picks you up and maybe someone else on the same trip and then deposits you. We also looked at some non-self-driving modes that we're still kind of grappling with from a modeling perspective. I would definitely say that's true. And those include, again, the shared vehicles, so like the floating car share, the public bike share system, and then also the ride hail, which I think at this point, it feels somewhat more established, although there are still questions about how it will evolve in the future. That means that I'm not talking about a few of the things that we've heard today, and I didn't even think of one of them, which was the autonomous transit vehicle, kind of different. But so I'm not talking about the privately owned self-driving cars, not talking about e-scooters or e-bikes or any of the other kind of micro-mobility space. No, we didn't ask questions about Uber helicopters, but now I kind of wish we had thought about it. That would have been a fun situation. So like I said, our data approach was sort of old. We did a literature review. We looked at for the best and least biased estimates we could find on the supply side of some of these new technologies. So in modes that were already in wide operation, we did a scan of market rates at the time. Again, most of this took place about a year and a half or maybe almost 2 years ago for some of the lit review. Car and bike share, ride hailing, we could get a sense of what they cost now. Will they cost that in the future? It's uncertain, but we put some fuzz around that. The self-driving options, we did a review of literature on the probable costs and market rates of them in the sort of early phase. I'll be honest and say a lot of that came from Europe, and so we did our best to kind of translate to a U.S. context, but it's challenging, but they were a little ahead of us, and I think maybe still are on research on the supply side of some of these technologies. On the demand response side, we did a stated choice survey, so we put people in real situations. In fact, we pivoted off of their own recent travel situation. So, you know, it's the sort of survey design where you say, think of a recent trip that you took to work, give us a little information about it, and then what if you had these options, and cycling through, you can start to get a sense of the trade-offs people might make, even though, of course, it's a stretch to think of a self-driving car picking you up. It was national in scope, but only in the largest cities, so the top 50 UCAs, so including, you know, some down into the mid-sized cities, but Portland's and Chicago's and New York's and LA's also. Like I said, it was adaptive, so we were striving for putting people in a realistic situation. So we pivoted everything off of their real costs, and where we didn't have that information, we relied on the most recent NHTS data to get what we hoped were realistic sort of travel times, you know, on roadways, and realistic operating environments. It was web-based. We looked at home-based work for people who did work outside the home, and also home-based non-work trips. Everything may tell you, though, we wanted to kind of constrain the space again, so we didn't have too many variables in play, and so all the trips were thinking about a trip you took from home. Right? So leaving aside some of those other issues, but going to either work or somewhere that wasn't work. So here's just this is a fuzzy version, but this is what people would see on the web on the left, what they would see on their smartphone. We made sure it worked there on the right, and what would happen is after they gave us some information about their recent trip, they would get a series of 3 cards, and they would get 5 sort of bundles of cards where they made a decision for each trip, and then they repeated that with another recent trip. And we decided, rather than giving them funky pictures of autonomous vehicles, to really focus on the attributes. We wanted people to be thinking about, what would I pay? How long would it take? How long would I have to wait? How far would I have to walk? Rather than thinking about, that's a pretty stupid-looking car. I don't know if I'd want to see it, right? So because we think in the long run, you know, these kind of things tend to win the day, right, over your initial reaction to, whoa, I wouldn't want to ride in a funky car like that. So you can see a little more info there. Here's our kind of demographic spread, with the size of the ring indicating the number of responses we got from each of the top 50 there. You know, you can eyeball it and see that there was certainly some under and over response in some places, but in general, it's more or less tracked representatively in terms of population in cities. Now, within the cities, I'll send you to the report to see the full demographic breakdown respondents. They weren't entirely representative as you would expect, but we did our best to try to account for that in modeling. So we built a big board that then got coded into software. So if you look at something like, let's say that first call in the self-driving alternative, the in-vehicle travel time either pivoted off the person's time if they had taken the trip to work. So we didn't think that, you know, we didn't consider long-term impacts of like AVs making travel faster or increasing capacity. Just if a person took 20 minutes to go to work, we would say the in-vehicle time in a self-driving car would also be 20 minutes. If we didn't have that because they rode transit or rode a bike or walked or something, we use that NHTS-based estimate. Then for out-of-pocket costs, we used our survey of likely rates and to put a kind of range around that, and so it would give them something between 30 cents and $2 a mile, which is wide, but about the range that we were comfortable with from research that it might fall into early on. And then you see wait time, walk time, and again, all of this is written up in the report, which I'll give you a link to, but just nice to get a sense of how we were setting this up. So we tried to keep it as objective as possible, but there's always some subjectivity in how you bound your space and impact results. So the first interesting thing is just thinking about, before we do any modeling, just looking at switch rates. Anytime you give people an experiment, for one, you hope that they sometimes take the bait, or otherwise you were giving them inferior options over and over, right? And they just, it's a pretty meaningless experiment if they just have to stick with what I'm doing all the time. So we first looked at the switching rates, and so these are rates that people switched away from the current mode they were using for a trip and to an emerging mode. So the current mode is there on the x-axis, and you notice some interesting trends. I mean, one of them is that the switching rate was relatively high. People were substituting among modes as the cost got more favorable, or the travel time, or some other aspects that that we weren't directly measuring, maybe. Motorcyclists, they weren't getting off the bike. There really is a bar there, 0%. But one thing you'll notice is that, not surprising, right? There's a lot more sort of competition within some of these emerging modes. So if you're already using ride hail or a taxi or bike share or car share, your willingness to switch to a new version of that technology is pretty high, right? Which probably doesn't surprise us. You've already made that first jump, and now if you see something that promises to be maybe even better, hey, yeah, I'll hop over here and try a shared ride hail, or I'll try maybe even something that's self-driving, right? The other things you'll probably notice here is that the ones most resistant to switch or had the most inertia were those traditional private modes. So a bike that you own, getting a ride from a family member or a friend, driving your own car, riding a motorcycle, although that was a small sample. But so it does give you a sense that people are not necessarily all going to hop into self-driving cars, even if they're a little bit cheaper or faster. They don't have to deal with parking or whatever. The initial push might come more from competition within the existing modes, and that's important for policy, important for modeling, et cetera. You'll also notice that there wasn't a strong effect in most cases of trip purpose when people were in these situations. They were switching at pretty similar rates for the most part for commute and non-commute travel. There are some noticeable exceptions there, for instance, being more likely to switch away from a shared ride hail on a commute trip, or from getting a ride with someone else. Maybe that makes some sense to us. If there's another way to get to work or to get to your transit stop without having to bug someone for a ride, you might be more willing to do that. So those are just switching rates. No model behind this. Nothing's controlled for. It's just the pure results of the experiment. How often people switched away from their current mode. We started doing some modeling with this, and it's developing over time. But initially, we just specified a fairly simple model so we could kind of start to answer some of these questions without getting too far in the weeds, and you can do that quickly with this number of attributes and possibilities, right? So it's just a simple multinomial logit model where the probability of choosing either sticking with your current mode or one of two emerging modes, one of which is going to be self-driving or AV in each choice situation, is just a function of the in-vehicle travel time, the waiting time, the walking time, and the out-of-pocket cost, all right, and some interactions of some of these things. That was kind of our starting point to start to understand how people are going to respond. They're going to behave like they do traditional modes, or is there something really new? Well, one interesting thing is after you control for time and cost, is to think about the kind of inherent bias or inertia towards certain modes, right? And the immediate takeaway from this, the preliminary takeaway is it's all else equal, stick with what we got, right? So if there's no money on the hood of that autonomous car out in front of my house, I think I'll probably just keep driving mine. You can see though that there's a spread across the modes. It does vary, with actually the AVs having somewhat less bias, whether that's because they're kind of on the horizon and still shiny, and don't have the baggage of maybe Uber and Lyft or so, or if there's something really going on there that makes them more appealing. Again, holding their operating characteristics constant. It's interesting. The other thing I want to point out here is the way that the shared ride inverts with autonomous vehicles versus the Uber, Lyft, ride hail we have now. If there's a driver in the car, the bias is less. In other words, you're more prone to being interested in the shared ride-hailing situation, the Uber pool or Lyft line, right? On AV, it switches. When there's not a driver in the car, you're actually more averse to sharing it. So, and it kind of makes sense. You put yourself in the place of being in a car, there's no driver, someone else gets in that you don't know. That's kind of, it's an unusual situation, right? It's not one that we put ourselves in often. So it's something to think about when we model that some of these things, even if we catch up to the current ride-hailing, because we're finally getting a little bit of data, we might have to rethink things again when this new technology comes on, even if it looks similar on paper, right? And this is a big one, right? So all of these, we're in that dangerous zone where we don't really have the data, and so when we get these new tools, a lot of times it's just someone thinking, well, and at the TRB Applications Conference, if you were there, I saw a lot of discounting, right, of the value of time. If you're in a self-driving car, maybe you can do something else, and maybe that time is not so onerous, is the idea. And I saw discount rates ranging from 20 to 50% discount on the cost of time in vehicle. So I'll ask you, from our survey results, the AV travel time discount is like an auctioneer. What would you say?
30. I'll go 30%.
30%. 30%. I got 30% over here from the gentleman in the blue. I hear lower. We're going lower from Ray. Well, this is the least exciting graph you'll probably see all month. These were the difference in the in-vehicle travel time parameters. An insignificant 2% bonus for riding that self-driving car. So maybe people aren't so excited to sit in a car and twiddle on their phones. I don't know. Or maybe this is a problem for marketing to solve. I'm not sure. But I would say be skeptical. If you're seeing scenarios or models that are putting in large discounts at this point. Now, this is an average over everyone. More sophisticated modeling can start to introduce some heterogeneity there, and we might see some people for whom there is a significant discount or some trips. But I will say that we did look at some of the obvious stuff. This did hold for purpose, working non-work, and it did hold for those long trips. So this idea that, well, if you got a 5-mile commute, there's not much you can get done, even if you're not having to drive. But what if you have a 15-mile commute, or a 20-mile, or a 25-mile? And we checked at each of these intervals just to see if there was any movement. No, it held over distance, at least in our setup and sample. I mean, I still believe there are certain cases and certain people, which is probably true, but it does give you some pause about, right, this is, like, to Alex, where you set that neutral position in your policy lever is important, right? Because if you set it at, if you set neutral at 50%, and you try to jam it lower, you're probably already well away from the potential there. So I think it's maybe a cautionary tale. A couple of last things, and then I certainly wouldn't want to cut into questions or lunch, either one. But you also have to, you can flip this around, and we can go back through our choice scenarios and say, what if we hadn't had this information on the kind of inherent bias for and against certain emerging modes? What if we left that out and we tried to make predictions with assuming everything started from an equal footing? So this is the prediction bias we would have made if the mode-specific preferences were ignored and we just dropped in time and cost and went on our merry way. And you can see that obviously all of these modes, there was a negative bias toward them, which means we would tend to over-predict, and by fairly substantial amounts, somewhere between 10, 9, and 30 percentage points in terms of the probability of choosing that mode. We would be over-predicting if we didn't kind of penalize the fact that if it comes down to 5 minutes and $5, I'd rather drive my car than get in an Uber in a lot of situations. That's sort of a thing. If you're missing that inherent preference, then you got an issue. Now, the caveat here, of course, is that the emerging modes are kind of a natural disadvantage because we can't really disentangle just the inertia effect, because most of the people in our sample weren't using emerging modes yet. They're already comfortable with something more conventional, whether it's transit or their own car or their bike, right? And so you figure there's a natural, inclination to stick with what you've got. So over time, maybe these decline as people have more experiences with the new mode. But for now, again, be cautious of setting everything from an equal start, at least for the near future, and watch out for giving things bonuses where we really maybe don't have the data to sort of support it. I told you that I would get to equity, and we're just starting to get there, but one question we can ask is from this set of experiences of people's actual trips and our plausible ideas of how long it would take in an emerging mode. Is there equity potential here? And this is one area that we're looking into is let's leave cost aside for a moment, right? These technologies might be too costly for someone who's making less than $15,000 a year or even less than $35,000 a year. Certainly the Uber helicopter probably fits that category. But we can still look at this kind of travel time delta and other things. So we also know that people in these lowest income groups are the ones that often suffer the long trips, the long wait times, the poor transit service, working at odd hours, for instance. And so it does show up that there's a average potential in those lowest groups of something from 7 to 12 minutes per trip that some of these emerging modes might be able to save them if we can get the policies right so that it is affordable and accessible and available to some of those groups. So this is going to take more work on both the modeling side and kind of mining our data and other data to understand that. But I think this is what I was getting at earlier with Nick, is these are the kind of things I think you've got to get on top of before some company comes and they're wanting to sign that first contract with a city. You want these things in your pocket so that you can get as much as you can to kind of make it an equitable outcome where it otherwise might very well not be. You don't want to say to everyone that's making $200,000 or more, 4 minutes per trip at the expense of everyone else. So I think there is potential there, but obviously it's going to take some new policies and modeling capabilities to get there. So I've already kind of been through these. So I certainly don't have to read them, but I'll give you the quick bullet version, which is, in general, what we found from this research is that emerging modes are generally not preferred, all else equal. If we assume that, we'll probably overpredict for a while their shares. AV technology it may actually lower demand for ride sharing unless we can figure out something like this transit that makes it, more approachable, perhaps. But a driverless Uber makes people a little less interested in having someone share the vehicle with them. There's inertia, and it varies a lot across modes, so that there are going to be winners and losers as these shifts occur, and those, transit did show up as a potential loser. We also would look at trips by personal vehicles as being less likely to kind of be, to be poached or to switch to these new modes. So just thinking about that in modeling, this might not be getting people out of the single occupancy vehicle trips. But on the plus side, it also might not be getting people off their bicycle or sort of a healthy activeness. No evidence for a significant shift in value travel time in our sampling setup for autonomous vehicles. But I think, I mean, one overarching thing is there was a lot of switching. You saw it, and this is not necessarily an unbiased sample, but it's a pretty broad sample. And if the self-driving tech were to decline in cost as much as kind of the research is showing it might, if taking a driver out of that Uber really makes it that much cheaper, then we could definitely see some pretty significant shifts in urban travel patterns and kind of pulling from all over. And that's kind of a new thing too, right? Some of these modes are kind of unconstrained relative to, say, a transit line or a car sharing zone or bike share station. So I think there's, obviously a lot to learn, but the more we can kind of grapple with real data and put people into situations where they're having to make these choices, the more we can sort of put those levers in the neutral position and then go from there. That's the goal, I think. And with that, I'm done. There's some links we can maybe share around or something if you're interested in more. Some of this work is also feeding into some development of vision eval, so that's exciting to kind of try to start to get some real parameters from the real world into these models and fill in those bubbles, or I guess unfill the bubbles from Ray's chart, right? So that we do have some sensitivity to these types of changes. With that, I will hand it back over. Thanks, Carol.
A couple of questions for Joe before we transition to close it up.
Hey, Joe, did you capture any socio-demographics of the people? So when you see you obviously captured income at some point.
Yeah.
So when you see that there's no change between AV and non-AV or the in-vehicle time, are the higher income people showing up more?
Well, this was model M0.G or something, so yeah, we're still getting there. But that's it's sort of the next step. Although, just in poking around, these results hold up pretty well. But there are other ways that we kind of need to bring in. One struggle is that this is a national sample, and so we're averaging over all of these cities with very different sort of relative income levels. So, 50,000 in Portland is not equal to 50,000 in Manhattan, and so even if you bend your income, you really also sort of need an adjustment. And so, I'd say we did capture quite a bit. We're still working through it. We've got all the usuals of gender, race, income, household size, car ownership, having a driver's license. There are a lot of dimensions. We're still grappling with the modeling, but just because there's such a need for it and we already feel like research is behind, we sort of just dove in and started pulling out what we could with these caveats that we might see some changes off the average, right, once we start to see a distribution of some of these things. But right now, let's look at the average and at least get a ballpark, I guess, was the idea. It's a good question. Yeah, I don't know. You should
go ahead.
Yeah.
It looks like because of the stated preference survey, you kept the cost for like motor vehicle versus bike share or transit the same. So that would be personal cost. Did you look at like societal costs being incorporated at all? So
yeah,
obviously the cost to actually operate a motor vehicle is much higher than the cost to operate other modes.
Sure. No, since we were just looking at the individual decision maker perspective, to the extent that they took that into account when they were offered something like bike share, and we did see in some certain cases there was quite a bit of shifting to public bike share. I presume where people probably didn't have it or wasn't accessible to them. So that was interesting. So in cases like that, it might be there. We can't really disentangle it, but we left the people free to kind of think about these modes the way they did. But we were not presenting any information to them that would kind of color their thought of different modes in terms of, and also here's the true societal cost of your commute. We didn't want to depress them either. I mean.
Well, yeah, and I guess that is reflected in the cost of like an auto trip. You kept the cost the same for all, right?
We did, yeah. So we just took them at their word in terms of the cost of their own auto trip. So we just asked them what do you pay out of pocket? Does your employer help pay for for parking for one? And how much time does it take you? And yeah, it's so challenging to know what parts of that auto cost people are considering, because, for a lot of people, I think it's purely out of pocket, and for others, they think the next step, and some are thinking about their environmental impact, but
well, and one of the reasons I asked was, from the policy perspective, we're starting to see regulation of congestion charging is coming to New York City, and so that would then be reflected back into the cost of an auto trip.
Yes. Yeah, and then you run into the problem of how do you portion that? It's kind of like the Portland study where they had to grapple with, how do you assign a parking cost to these very uncertain, it's like how much of a toll will you pay? You'll pay part of it. They'll pass the cost on, right? If your AV is getting tolled every time it goes over the bridge, but it's probably at some reduced rate you would expect, right? Yeah. There's just so many questions. Yeah.
Great. For the interest of time, we have to close down. But first off, let's thank all four panelists for a great presentation and very informative discussion here. Great. Thanks. Next on the agenda is meeting and events that we have on our agenda. I think we haven't pinned down a specific date yet. So the first one is in November, December, that we will have the OMSA freight subcommittee on OMSA's freight modeling recommendation, freight research projects, freight data opportunity, and in late January after TRB, we'll have our recurring post-TRB brought back to join us before this discussion for those folks, to both talk a little bit about what's most impressive in the upcoming TRB, and then what from there, and then we can there's like a social and a chat social. I'm not sure whether Tara or Kyle, or for that matter anybody else here have any events, any announcement that you want to add. This would be good to me. Okay, other event, that's all for today. We are 2 minutes ahead, so thank you all for coming.